Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Rabbi Katie Bowman, Senior Rabbi here at Touro. I want to welcome everybody who's here in the chapel today, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us on our live stream. We're so glad to see everyone and to be able to house this very special event tonight. It's such an honor to partner with so many different facets of our community to be able to create this experience. We're so very honored to be the site of Ruth Behar's talk this evening, and just also delighted to be partnering with Aaron and the Goldring Center for Jewish and Multicultural Affairs at Jewish Federation. So I'd love to invite him up to say a few words, and then we will hear from our wonderful speakers and also our wonderful Anna Gershanik, who is really the vision and the engine behind this experience and so many others in our community for whom we're so grateful. So thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoy your time.
Thank you, Rabbi. My name is Aaron Block. I am the Director of Jewish Multicultural and Governmental Affairs at the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans. So I oversee the Center for Jewish Multicultural Affairs that Rabbi Bowman referred to. Again, I just want to very few words. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so honored to have Ruth Behar here with us. I'm going to invite Anna Gershanik up to give a little introduction. I don't think I can top what Rabbi Bowman already said about Anna. I think everyone in this room knows that Anna Gershanik is just a force of nature in this city and beyond, and without her, programs like this with this incredible author would not be necessarily happening. So Anna, love to have you up, and thank you so much for joining.
Hi, welcome everybody, bienvenidos. I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to have Ruth Behar here. You are here for a treat, because tomorrow at the festival, she's going to speak about one of her books. And now you have the opportunity to ask her lots of questions because she has published so many wonderful books, and I'm a big fan of her. So I just will do a very brief introduction. Ruth was born in Havana, Cuba, and came to live in New York with her family in 1962, when she was a very young girl. And she received her BA in literature from Wesleyan University and her master's degree and PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton University. She resides in Ann Arbor. She's a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, and she has had a strong attachment through her whole life to the Spanish matters, and she had spoken about many things that are even common to the Latino community today, especially the migrants. And also she has focused on women issues, and her most recently published book that she was going to present tomorrow at the Tulane Fest is about a 12 years old generational saga of 4 girls that are 12 years old, and although it's geared to young readers, I have to tell you, I love the book. I think it's for all ages. But so without anything, she has received numerous awards, and I met Ruth when I was writing for the Times-Picayune, Nuestro Pueblo, and she came here. She was here to give a lecture at Tulane and at Loyola. But I didn't know, I just found out when I was bringing her to Touro Synagogue that she had been back in 2018, and she had toured this synagogue with her parents, her husband, and her son. So, without any favor, she was here to receive an award which I didn't know about, and she told me. It was the award, the best Latina writer in children's books. Am I correct? And you'll tell them more about it. Okay. So without any further more words from me, let me ask Ruth to come here to the podium and speak to you. And thank you so much. And she's wonderful because she didn't have to do this, but she never hesitated to tell me yes as soon as I... So we are just so grateful to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Like there, is that good?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all those beautiful introductions. Thank you so much, Rabbi Bauman and Aaron and Anna. That was really amazing. I'm so honored to be here. So we met about 24 years ago, the year 2000. I think that was the first time I came to New Orleans. And then I think I was here for something related to anthropology. I don't know if that was maybe before or after. And then with my parents and with David, my husband who's here, and our son, and that was amazing back in 2018. So the prize that I received, it was the Pura Belpré Award for my first middle grade novel, my first novel for kids, which is called Lucky Broken Girl, and it's based on my life. And what's amazing is Pura Belpré was a Puerto Rican librarian who lived in New York, and she was the first to have Spanish circles in the library for bilingual kids, so that kids would get to read books and listen to books in English and Spanish. So it was really an honor to receive that award for the first novel that I wrote for kids. So I have just some very informal remarks to share with all of you, and I want to leave a lot of time for discussion and Q&A, anything that you want to know about my work or about the Jews of Cuba, which I'm going to speak about, and any other conversation that you'd like to have today. So very open to really talking with all of you, and I really want to get to know all of you and just find out more about New Orleans, because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm always more interested in what all of you have to say than what I have to say about myself. So let me share some thoughts. So I thought I would start by reading a poem. In addition to doing anthropology and writing fiction for kids, I also write poetry, and I've been writing poems for a long time. And there's this book, Everything I Kept, Todo lo que guardé, which is a bilingual book, and I wrote the poems in English and Spanish. And I love this book because it has these beautiful illustrations by a Cuban artist named Rolando Esteves, who just passed away a year ago. And well, the cover and then the interior art is just so incredibly beautiful. Just to give you an idea of what the art looks like. So he did these beautiful pen and ink sketches for the book. And anyway, I just want to share with you a poem called Prayer, which will kind of get this conversation about my work going. And if you like, I'll read it in English and Spanish. How does that sound? Because I think several people here who are bilingual. Prayer, I'll read it in English first. Too often, I am on my way home, driving down familiar streets. Only a few blocks to go, and out of nowhere, a merciless hand comes and wrings my heart dry. I tremble. Fog clouds my eyes. I am no longer sure if I am awake or dreaming. If I die, who will find me? All I can do is pray. Don't take me yet. Let me return home. I am almost there. Please? I don't know why this happens. What I know is that so far my prayers have been answered. Hardly breathing, I reach my house, and when I open the door, I hear many keys clanging, the keys my ancestors stubbornly took with them to their exile. And I'll read it in Spanish. Rezo. Esto me pasa con frecuencia, con demasiada frecuencia. Voy camino a casa, manejando por calles conocidas. Faltan solamente unas pocas cuadras y de no sé dónde viene una mano despiadada y exprime mi corazón hasta dejarlo seco. Tiemblo, una neblina tapa mis ojos. No puedo saber ya si estoy despierta o soñando. Si me muero, ¿quién me encontrará? Lo único que puedo hacer es rezar. No vengas por mí aún, déjame volver a casa. Ya casi llego. Por favor. No sé por qué me pasa esto. Solo sé que por ahora mis rezos han sido escuchados. Dejando casi de respirar, llego a mi casa. Al abrir la puerta, oigo el ruido de tantas llaves, las llaves que mis antepasados neciamente llevaron con ellos a su exilio. So I think it has kind of a different feel somehow, right, in each language. And so you know that I was born in Cuba and I grew up in the United States. Um, I was born in Havana, so next to the ocean, and of course speaking Spanish. And then we left Cuba after the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s. And actually we left Cuba via Israel. We spent a year in Israel. And curiously, we went to live on a kibbutz because my parents had nowhere else to go. They didn't have passports. They had never left Cuba until that time. But my mother had an uncle who was a co-founder of a kibbutz, Kibbutz Gash, which is a Spanish-speaking kibbutz founded by a Mexican, an Argentine, and a Cuban Jew. And so we went there, which I always thought was sort of funny because we were escaping communism and then going to live on a Jewish-style commune. But that's where we went. We spent a year there, and then my father wasn't very happy there because he is Sephardic, and and at that time not the synagogue, but the culture was very Ashkenazi focused in Israel and specifically in that kibbutz. So he didn't really love it there. My mother was ready to stay and work in the kitchen forever. She loved her job there at the kibbutz. But then the rest of the family ended up moving to New York, and they didn't want to be there on their own. So then after a year, we moved to New York, and that's where I grew up. And so I was an immigrant child who spoke Spanish, and apparently some Hebrew as well, which I forgot, but I did speak it for a while then. And so I was just placed in an elementary school classroom, a first grade classroom, and I was expected to figure out how to speak English. This is before they had ESL programs and any kind of support. And so that was really hard, and I remember being very afraid that I was not smart enough because I didn't know English, and back at that time they also had different classes, and the kids were very aware that this was the class for the kids that were not doing that well, the dumb class, as the kids themselves called it. So I was very aware of that, and it took me a while to learn English, but then eventually I learned it, and and it really made it like a goal for myself that I was going to learn English very well. I would even, as I got older, I would even imitate a British accent, thinking that was the proper English that I should be speaking. And I very much became a translator for my parents as I learned more English than they did. And I think that had a big impact on me being an immigrant child and being a translator for my parents, because I think those are some of the things that led me to want to study anthropology, where I would always be living in other places and always having to translate experiences from one language to another and one culture to another. So anthropology was, for me, kind of a search for connection to the Spanish language, to the Spanish-speaking world, and to my Latina heritage. And I started with this poem, Prayer, or Rezo, because I feel that my roots are very much in diaspora, in different layers of diaspora. So my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, were from Poland and Russia, and they immigrated to Cuba in the 1920s separately, and they met in Cuba. And my maternal grandfather actually worked on the railroad in Cuba, and one of the documents he was very proud of that I inherited was a railway ID card that he had from the Cuban railroad. He had worked for the railroad company in Cuba, all the way on the eastern end of Cuba in Camagüey. And he was very, very proud of that. He would always bring it out and show it to me, and that was something that I really wanted to inherit of his, a document I really wanted, and I did inherit it. But like most men, most of the Jewish immigrants that arrived to Cuba, he was a street peddler, and he peddled around from door to door and went off into the countryside to peddle shirts and fabric and things like that. And then my maternal grandmother, whose name was Esther, she came from Poland, and her father was already in Cuba, and he needed one of his children to come to help bring the rest of the family, because there were 7 siblings altogether, and her mother. But her father, my great-grandfather, had a lot of trouble making money and saving up enough to be able to bring the rest of the family and be able to buy passage on ships for them. So my grandmother decided that she would be the one to go to Cuba and would help him bring the rest of the family. And so that story inspired a previous novel to the one I'm presenting today, called Letters from Cuba. And so it's about a Polish Jewish girl, 12 years old, who goes to Cuba and helps to bring the rest of the family to the island. On my father's side, they were Sephardic. So my paternal grandparents were from Turkey. And they both also immigrated separately and met in Cuba. They were from a small town called Silivri. This is a town near Istanbul, really now on the outskirts of Istanbul. And I was lucky to be able to go to Turkey once a couple of years ago and actually see the town and see the house where my paternal grandmother lived in Silivri. And so then I have this Turkish ancestry from my father's side of the family, and they settled in Cuba as well in the 1920s and lived in Havana. And so that grandmother, the paternal grandmother, who I called Abuela, and the other grandmother, the Ashkenazi grandmother, I called her Baba. So we had Baba and Abuela, one referring to the Yiddish background and the other one to the Spanish-speaking Ladino background. So the paternal grandmother, my Abuela, had a mysterious story because she was sent to Cuba by her parents, and her sister stayed behind, and she had a brother. They all stayed behind, but for some reason she was sent to Cuba by herself. And the interesting thing about her is that she sang old Sephardic songs in Ladino, and she played the oud. The oud is a Middle Eastern instrument that looks like a mandolin or an oud, O-U-D. It's spelled like a lute. And so she brought an oud with her, and she sang the songs. And then after she got married to my grandfather and had 4 children, she stopped singing and stopped playing the oud. And the oud was just hanging from a nail on the wall of their apartment or tenement apartment, I should say, in Old Havana where they lived. So that story captured my imagination, and that's what led me to write this new book that I'll talk about more in a moment, Across So Many Seas, which is also coming out next week in Spanish, A Través de los Mares. So it's in both languages. And so this book is inspired by the paternal grandmother, and the previous book, Letters from Cuba, is inspired by my maternal grandmother. So each grandmother inspired a book because, each of them led to this journey to Cuba that has been so important to me. So you might be wondering, why did Jewish people live in Cuba, right? What led Jews to want to immigrate to Cuba? Well, what happened is in 1924, the United States passed an immigration law that basically limited the numbers of people that could immigrate to the U.S. from Eastern and Southern Europe. They didn't specifically say Jewish people couldn't enter the United States, but they were among the groups of people that the U.S. was trying to keep at very, very low numbers. So they essentially instituted a quota system, and so very, very few people could come from those parts of the world where so many Jews were trying to immigrate from in this period between World War I and World War II, as conditions were worsening for Jewish people in Europe. And so they couldn't get into the United States, Jewish immigrants at this time, but they heard, of course, in a pre-internet era when they didn't have that much information, but they heard that if they could just get to Cuba, Cuba is so close to the United States that they could practically swim over. This is actually a story that's circulated in the Yiddish-speaking community. So people said, all right, let's get to Cuba, and then once we're in Cuba, we'll head over to the United States. And some people did, in fact, do that. For some people, Cuba was a kind of trampoline. Get to Cuba, spend a couple of years in Cuba, get Cuban papers, and then be able to immigrate from Cuba to the United States. What's so interesting about Cuba in the 20s and 30s, well, from the teens to the 20s and 30s, is that people were immigrating to Cuba. Nowadays, we think of Cuba as a place that creates immigrants, right? Cuba's constantly losing population. But at that time, Cuba was a very prosperous island nation with a lot of sugar wealth, and people were immigrating to Cuba. There were opportunities in Cuba at that time. And so these immigrants, like my grandparents, found their way to Cuba and felt very much at home in Cuba. On the one hand, the Jewish immigrants who were Ashkenazi, like on my mother's side, felt very at home in Cuba because they weren't experiencing the discrimination and anti-Jewish hatred that they had experienced, particularly in Poland and in Russia at that time. And I remember my maternal grandmother, Esther, saying that it was like a breath of fresh air for her to be in Cuba, not to be automatically hated for being Jewish. So she, fell in love with Cuba. And then on the other side of the family, the Sephardic side, because they spoke Ladino is an old form of Spanish with other languages mixed in from the various diasporas of the Sephardic Jews. They, on the other hand, felt at home because they understood enough Spanish from the Ladino that they felt, oh, we're kind of in España again. This is like the Spain. This is like the Spain of the 15th century that we left behind because Spanish. They felt so at home in the Spanish language. So these two communities really felt very much at home on the island, and both my parents were born in Cuba. But the communities were so separate. The Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities were so separate that when my parents married in 1956, they considered it a kind of intermarriage. That's how how differentiated these two communities were, and it makes sense because the Ashkenazi community spoke Yiddish and had a whole set of food traditions, gefilte fish and matzo ball soup and so on. Those traditions, and they were so different from the Sephardic traditions. And I saw that you have out here the stuffed grape leaves, the yaprak, the yaprak, and the stuffed tomatoes, and borrecas, and bulemas, and baklava, and so on. I mean, all very, very different cuisine on the Sephardic side. So the two sides of the family, viewed themselves as extremely different from each other. And particularly on my mother's side of the family, they were very worried. And one thing that I heard, I mean, I was too, I wasn't around yet. One thing that I heard was that my maternal grandmother Esther asked, when her daughter, my mother, and my father decided to marry, she said, "But how will we speak to Albertico and his family? They don't speak Yiddish." And that just seemed like such a loss, that the Yiddish wasn't going to be there. And keep in mind that by the 1950s, this is so amazing. So most of this Jewish community forms in the teens and 20s in Cuba, largely in Havana, but they also move out all over the island to the eastern part of Cuba, to Santiago and Guantanamo, and to the central part of Cuba. There's synagogues and Jewish cemeteries all over the island. Which was so amazing. And by the 50s, they had prospered so much that they had bilingual schools. Right, just before I left Cuba, I was enrolled in the same school that my mother had gone to in Havana, which was a Spanish and Yiddish school. So had the revolution not happened, or had the revolution been different, and had I stayed in Cuba and grown up there rather than here, I might have been a Yiddish speaker because I was being sent to a bilingual Yiddish-Spanish school. But it's so amazing to me that this community, in a period of 30 to 40 years, created Jewish day schools. They had a theater. They had, kosher restaurants in Havana. What else? Radio stations. They had a Sephardic radio station too. I mean, they created lots of institutions and Yiddish publications as well, and books. So they created such a lively community and such a strong Jewish community in a very, very short period of time, in this period of 30 or 40 years, which I always found to be really amazing. And I was briefly part of it because I was born a few years before the revolution and was briefly part of it, sent to school, and so on. But then the Cuban Revolution begins in 1959, and the Jewish community at first is very supportive of Castro and the revolution that's taking place. It seems like it's going to be a good thing, a good democratic revolution after a terrible dictatorship that has been in power for a long time. And so people are supportive of the revolution, and then all of that changes when the revolution moves in a communist direction, and they nationalize properties and take away people's stores and businesses and so on. So in the case of my family, just to give you the example, on my mother's side, by the 50s, my maternal grandparents had a small lace store in Havana that was called Casa Maximo, Maximo was the name my maternal grandfather acquired in Cuba. His real name was Moshe Aaron, but that was apparently too complicated, and just like Ellis Island, people acquired new names in Cuba. So he became Maximo. And that was the name that everybody called him, to his last day. And so he opened up a lace store called Casa Maximo. And then on my father's side of the family, my grandfather remained a peddler, till the day that they left Cuba. But all of this private enterprise was nationalized by the Cuban Revolution. And so for many people in the Jewish community who had mom and pop businesses or other kinds of private enterprise, they decided they didn't want to stay in Cuba because they didn't want to lose, their businesses and their economic independence and freedom. And then there was also the concern that the Jewish day schools, like all parochial schools, were going to be shut down by the revolution, and a few years later they were. So these were all concerns that led people to decide to leave Cuba. That's what led my family to leave in the early 60s. And about 90% of a community of about 15,000 people decided to leave Cuba in the early 60s and then recreated their lives in Miami and in New York. I grew up in New York, but the larger community is in Miami. And so over the years, I decided as an individual and as an anthropologist that I really wanted to go back to Cuba and see Cuba with my own eyes. And this was something that my family and the community was very much against at the time. And it made me feel, or they made me feel, that I was being ungrateful for all the opportunities I'd had in the United States, that they had decided to leave, to give me and my brother and a better life in the US. And so the idea of going back to a place that they had left under a lot of duress seemed at first to be the wrong thing to do. But I couldn't help myself. I was extremely curious and wanted to see Cuba with my own eyes. I didn't have a lot of memories of Cuba because I was 4.5 when we left, so I remembered very little of Cuba, but it was very much a deep part of my soul, and I had heard so many stories about Cuba and so much nostalgia, and I had grown up speaking Spanish as well. And so I started traveling to Cuba in the early 90s and going back and forth for about 30 years, going 2 and 3 times or more a year, taking Jewish groups to Cuba as well. I made a documentary about the Jews of Cuba called Adiós Querida, Goodbye My Love, focusing on the Sephardic community in Cuba and outside of Cuba, the Cuban Sephardic community, and kind of being a bridge between those who stayed and those who left, because I felt that there was a lot of division between those who had remained on the island and those that had become part of the diaspora community. So I made that film, and then afterwards I kept asking for people's stories and traveling around the island and finding all the Jewish people that still remained in Cuba, which was an amazing experience. And I wrote a book entitled An Island Called Home, which was about this journey through the island and the different stories that people told me about their Jewish identity in Cuba. And what's so amazing is that through the years of the revolution, when religion was really suppressed, which were the 60s and 70s and 80s, then in the 90s, the Cuban government allowed religious participation again, but in that period of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when there was a lot of suppression of religion, how the Jewish community still maintained their connection to a Jewish identity in so many amazing ways. Very few young people would participate in those decades because it was very hard to enter the university if you had any kind of religious affiliation or religious identity. But nevertheless, the elders in the community would get together, and they didn't have enough people for a minyan, so they created what they called the Cuban minyan. And so if they had 6 people, it would be 6 people, 3 Torahs, and then God would be the 10th, and that became known as the Cuban minyan. So they found ways to hold on, to maintain a connection to a thread of Jewish identity and Jewish religion, which was really amazing. And then in the 90s, when the Cuban government decided actually to change the constitution and to allow people, if they wanted to have a religious identity and to be members of the Communist Party if they wanted to be. So there was no longer a contradiction between those two identities. And so many people reconnected with their Jewish identity. Others who had married, as most had to do because there was such a small community, had married out of the Jewish tribe, then brought, their spouses and other family, into the community, and there were conversions, and really amazing. There's a rabbi that recently I was on a virtual panel with him, Rabbi Steinhandler, if any of you have heard of him. He's a really important Argentine rabbi who lives in Chile, and he has been involved with the Jewish community in Cuba for, more than 30 years, and has been involved with the conversions and marriages and just teaching people about Judaism. He's a really amazing person. So the community revitalized, and that was really amazing, but it also led to some people choosing to leave the community and find their way to Israel, and some of them to the United States. So the community kind of revitalized and grew, and then sort of shrunk again. But now it's going through another revitalization now at this moment after COVID and the pandemic. So wanted to share all that background with you, and just to say that I wanted to be this bridge between island and diaspora. That was kind of my role as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist. But I also felt the need to use like another part of my soul and my brain through writing fiction. So after spending so many years listening to stories, documenting stories and film and writing, I then started thinking that I wanted to also imagine things that I couldn't learn about as an anthropologist. The archives that weren't there, the documents that weren't there, the stories I didn't get to hear. And then that led me to fiction, and I started writing fiction about 10 years ago. And I started with Lucky Broken Girl, which in Spanish we decided to give it a very different title. Mi buena mala suerte is what it's called in Spanish, Lucky Broken Girl, because it was really hard to say Lucky Broken Girl in Spanish. Dichosa niña rota didn't quite make it in Spanish, so I gave it a very different title, Mi buena mala suerte. And so that book, I started reflecting on this childhood of mine as an immigrant girl in New York, and what that was like, and just remembering the family and the neighbors and the friends. And then something terrible that happened at that time, where there we were immigrants, and we got to New York, everything seemed to be going well, and we were in a terrible car accident. And that really happened, and I decided to base Lucky Broken Girl on that story. We had shortly arrived from Cuba, everything kind of was starting to fall into a good pattern, and we were in this car accident on the Belt Parkway, and I ended up in a body cast with a very severe injury to my right leg, and I had to be in bed for a year, taken care of by my mother. And so that became the focus of Lucky Broken Girl, but it was not just about healing, it was also about being immigrants, and here we had been moving so much, we had to have mobility in order to be able to move from place to place, and suddenly there was this girl who couldn't move and had to be in bed. And that girl was me, but of course I didn't take notes about my life at the age of 10, so I had to imagine it all, reimagine it all, and reimagine, what my mother felt like at that time, what it was like for my father, remembering that my father was working 3 jobs, in order to be able to pay for hospital and doctor bills and so on. So all of that inspired Lucky Broken Girl, and that's the book that got me into the whole world of children's fiction. And the character of Lucky Broken Girl is based on me. Her name is Ruthie Mizrahi, and she is a Cuban Jewish girl growing up in New York. So you get some of that background and that identity. And then from there, I wrote the book that I mentioned, Letters from Cuba, based on my maternal grandmother's story, and that was a lot of fun to write because there was so much I didn't know about that whole immigration. So there were so many Jews from Poland who immigrated to Cuba that the word for a Jewish person in Cuba to this day is Polako or Polaka, feminine or masculine, Polako, Polaka. So a Polish person is a Jew in Cuba, and that's the term that they use even if you're Sephardic. They'll call you, una Polaka, un Polaco, right? Because there were so many Polish Jews who immigrated to Cuba. It's Russo, todos son Rusos, right? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly, and so that's what took place in Cuba. So, but when I thought about my grandmother being part of that migration of Polish Jews to Cuba, I realized how much I didn't know about what was it like to arrive from Poland to Cuba, without speaking Spanish, never having tasted a pineapple. What was it like? And I drew on a story that my maternal grandfather, the Russian grandfather, would tell, that when he first got to Cuba in his efforts to keep kosher, the only thing he would eat was bread and bananas. That's all he ate for months. Challah, you could actually get challah in Havana. There was a Jewish bakery. No, he pedaled and walked so much that but that's all he had. So elements like that I didn't know. That was where I had to enter into the world of fiction, because I had to imagine, how did my grandmother learn Spanish? What were the first things she ate? How did she adjust to life in Cuba? And so that inspired that book. And now in this most recent book, and I also have a picture book called Tia Fortuna's New Home, which I can talk about later. And now in this new book, Across So Many Seas, this one I wanted to talk about the impact of 1492, right, which was the year that we associate with Columbus and the conquest of the Americas, but it was also the year of the expulsion of Jewish people from Spain, right? And that's the origin of the Sephardic Jewish community, is the expulsion in 1492. So I wanted to focus on that and the impact that this expulsion might still have on us today, centuries later. I'm really interested to think about, what did something like this that happened so long ago, what effect could it still have on us today? And so I did a lot of research and thinking about that. And then the book also takes us into the modern period. So there's a girl named Benvenida who lives in Spain, in Toledo, Spain in 1492. Then we move several centuries into the future, and there's a girl named Reina living in 1923 in Turkey. Then there's a girl named Allegra living in Cuba in 1961. And then there's a girl named Paloma living in Miami in 2003. And all those girls, their stories are going to interconnect by the end of the book. So you have to read it to find out exactly how. But if there's time, I would read a page or two from the book. I don't know how we're doing on time. Or do we want to? Yeah, you should read it. I'll just read this and then I'll open it up. I'll open it up to Q&A. So one of the things that I discovered, oh, thank you. Oh, no problem, thank you. Yeah, one of the things I discovered in my research is, this is now going back to 1492, so this is this moment when the Jews are being expelled from Spain. They have a choice. They can convert to Catholicism and stay in Spain, or they can leave and go somewhere else, because their religion isn't going to be allowed to be practiced anymore in Spain. And so when I read up on this, I learned that many families were divided by this, that there were some parts of the family, some members of the family that said, no, we're going to convert because we want to stay in Spain, this is our homeland, and then others who chose to leave within the same family. So I thought about that, and I thought about how a young person, a young girl named Benvenida at the age of 12, how she might be thinking about this as she's saying goodbye to a younger cousin named Miriam. Okay, so I'm just going to read you these pages from the book. I wonder how best to explain our situation to my darling little 6-year-old cousin. In a world that made sense, I'd be able to watch her grow and continue to give her my clothes when they got too small for me. I'd secretly teach her to write poems, and we could share our dreams. What can I tell her now that doesn't sound too sad and frightening? At last, I simply say, we have decided to move to another land. And then, trying my best to seem honest and cheery, I add, it'll be an adventure, and I'll come back and tell you all about it. Oh, I wish I could travel with you. Will you ride your donkey? Miriam's eyes get big. I want to see another land too. But your mother and father need you, precious one, my mother says. They can come with us, Miriam says. Tia Raquel sighs. We will stay here in Toledo, mi niña, so when Benvenida returns, she will have a place to stay. So when you come back, I'll see you more. Miriam flings her arms around my neck with such affection. I have to struggle not to cry. The sky is so pretty now. Let's count the stars, I say. This makes Miriam giggle. There are too many, but I am good at counting. While Miriam is counting, I hear Tia Raquel whisper to my father, when I am in church reciting the rosary, I still hear the Hebrew prayers in my ears. I hear the blast of the shofar. Then I look above and see angels and the spirits of mother and father weeping. Father wraps an arm around her shoulder. This is a difficult time, hermanica, and we each made the best choice we could. I am sure mother and father are blessing you from on high. Miriam had been listening. I hear the shofar and see the angels too. They are beautiful with rosy faces, like the ones smiling at the Virgin in the church. I start to smile at how Miriam is confusing the two religions until I see the terror in Tia Raquel's eyes and know how careful she has to be so her child won't say anything that could get them reported to the Inquisition. Tia Raquel stands and reaches for Miriam's hand. Time to go, Maria. Say goodbye to your cousin. Miriam holds on to me, not wanting to let go, and I don't want to let go either. Be a good girl, my darling cousin. Listen to your mother, I say. Next time I see you, we will sing happy songs and play the tambourine. Her eyes light up. Really? I nod, and we hug again, more tightly this time. Tia Raquel draws the shawl carefully around her face and wraps Miriam in a smaller shawl. Adios, they say. That word never sounded so sad. After they leave, I imagine little Miriam years from now trying to remember me, her cousin who left. She will never know that after she said adios, I gazed up at the sky and asked, will there be a next time? And I received no answer. I catch a whiff of mazapan de almendra, the almond marzipan of this land, and think of all I will miss. That night, I write a few words of goodbye to Toledo. I walk out into the courtyard, and when my eyes adjust to the darkness, I hide the parchment deep in one of the crevices in the walls surrounding our house. Maybe someone will read it one day and remember I lived here, and if the parchment is never found, at least some of my words will stay in Toledo. Because one of the things that's unique about Benvenida is she could read and write, because her mother comes from a family of printers. Very few girls could read and write in the 15th century, but she doesn't just write, she writes poems, and so she leaves this poem behind in Toledo. So I wanted to share that portion from the book because today we're here bringing together the Jewish community and the Latinx community, and I feel that when we look back to the 15th century, you know, there was a lot of unity, but then disunity got created, and I think there's a lot of people of Latinx background who may have Jewish ancestry, and then Jews from Spain, Sephardic Jews, connect with Spain as well through our language and our customs and our memory of Spain. So there are all these ways in which the two communities connect, and I hope in this book that I show how those two communities come together historically. So I'm going to end there and open it up to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you. Yes. Oh, thank you. Well, I mostly write in English. What I do sometimes do is I'll write poems in Spanish. So I can write short, fragmented pieces, but a long work like a book of prose, I find it much easier to write in English, I think because all my education, college education and so on, was all in English. But I always ask my publisher to publish my books in Spanish. It's really important to me that the books exist in Spanish, and I review the Spanish edition of the book before it's published. So this book, I reviewed the Spanish. I made some changes. There were some things that I thought needed to be phrased differently or just said differently. And there were some errors as well that I caught. So I always review the Spanish, but I don't feel I have enough strength in the language to be able to translate the whole book myself, or to write a prose work firsthand in Spanish. But I can review it because I know Spanish very well. But the time it would take me to translate, I'd rather use that time to write another book. So that's what I do. But it's really important to me that my work be available to readers in English and Spanish. And the poetry book, Everything I Kept, this one I did write in both languages myself. And I went back and forth. Some poems I started in Spanish and then translated them into English, and some I started in English and went to Spanish and kind of went back and forth, and how does it sound in each language? So with the poetry, I'm much more fluid and bilingual. I feel like I can control language better in poetry, but in prose, I don't feel I'm there to be able to write a long piece in Spanish. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My second question was, they say it's for children, but I didn't find it for children, really. I don't know for what age.
Yeah, it's supposed to be ages 10 and up. So it's a middle grade novel. It's hard because we have these categories these days for books, and it's so exciting that there's so much new literature coming out. And so books get categorized. It's like you have middle grade, and then you have young adult, and there are these different categories that books just get placed in. But I did write it, thinking that I would love for 10-year-olds and 11 and 12-year-olds to read it, and they are reading it, to be able to read this book. But I like the idea of writing for all ages, and books that a mother could read with a child, or a father could read with a child, or a grandparent could read with a child. And I want the book to be interesting for a young person, but to also be interesting for the adult that's reading the book. And I know that when I was a child, maybe it's because I spent a year in a body cast, so I just became very critical, and all I did was read books for a year since I couldn't move. But I didn't like books that talked down to me. I never liked like babyish, books. I guess I always wanted to be like very, grown up, even at the age of 10. And so I write for that child, that wants a book that's like just a little bit more maybe hard or compelling or raises difficult issues. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I read that 25% of the Turkish people that emigrated to Cuba were Jewish. What was the reason for their emigration to Cuba? And also, what was the reason for Turkish emigration at all? Was it the end of the Ottoman Empire? Or?
Yeah, it was the end of the Ottoman Empire, and there was a lot of concern at that time in the Jewish community that they wouldn't be able to maintain their traditions as they had, and there was particularly a lot of concern that they were going to lose the language of Ladino, because they were starting to enforce the use of only Turkish. And in fact, it was a very, multiphonic culture, the Ottoman Empire. There were people from so many different places, so many different languages, and so on. And so there's real concern that they were going to be losing their traditions, losing their language. And then, they had also fought a war, Turkish War of Independence as well. And a lot of the men, Turkish Jewish men who left at that time, were escaping the army as well, because serving in the army was almost a sure death as well. So I know that for many, this is what I heard was true for my paternal grandfather. That was the reason that he left Turkey. And then for the women, they often left with their families and restarted a life in Cuba. But as I said, my paternal grandmother's story was unusual because she was sent by herself to Cuba. Yeah. There's a hand over here too.
Thank you so much for being here. And this is a really, really beautiful book. And I love the fact that you've written it to be, as you said, read across generations. And I'm just wondering, you said you were like a little girl in a cast who loved to read. And I'm wondering what books you read as a young girl that were influential for you.
Well, this might sound funny, but, there wasn't quite as much choice as we have today, but I read all of Nancy Drew. I was a specialist, and there was the case of the Blue Locket. I mean, I was really into mysteries at the time, and particularly stories that had to do with travel and journeys. I think like Robinson Crusoe, I mean, just like books that had to do with journeys, because I couldn't go anywhere, and I was dreaming of like one day I'd be able to walk again, and I would travel and I would go to different exotic parts of the world. So I was also really interested in journeys. Then as I got older, like by high school, I had a really wonderful Cuban American teacher in high school she had been a college professor or university professor in Havana. And then when she got to the United States, her degree was no longer valid and she had to get a whole new PhD. But in the meantime, she was teaching high school, and I flourished so much under her and her mentorship. So I read a lot of poetry at that time, like Jose Marti, Cuban poet, and she was the teacher that encouraged me to write in Spanish. And then as I got older, Garcia Marquez, and just Latin American literature was really important to me as well. And then at some point, somehow in high school, though I didn't understand most of it, I read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and that also, sometime in my junior year in high school, I read it, and that also had a deep impact on my feminist thinking as well. So somehow by high school, all of this different reading came together. But I had a notebook where I kept notes about the books and the poems that I read, so I was very rigorous about that sort of stuff at that age, yeah.
Were you interested in English and American authors of children's books?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The interesting thing is I didn't realize that I was going to write for kids. A lot of people, like, that's their plan. Like, I want to be a children's, writer. But that wasn't the case with me. I started writing Lucky Broken Girl and in the voice of a 10-year-old girl. And I just started telling this, trying to sort of remember what it was like to be 10 and be in this body cast, right? So I just started writing in the voice of the girl. And I wasn't sure if it was, because you can have adult novels that are told in the voice of a child, but aren't necessarily children's literature. But this book, it just started to come out in the voice of the girl. And then I realized that I think this book is for kids. I don't think this is an adult book. This is a book for kids. And then at that point, I started reading up on literature, middle grade literature, and just seeing like what's being written today. So reading like Jackie Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, which is a verse novel, and many others. Margarita Engel, who's also a Cuban American writer, and I love almost all of her middle grade novels are verse novels, and that's something I want to try for my next book. I want to try to write a verse novel because I'm so interested in poetry. I want to try to bring, poetry and prose together. But she's another, an incredible writer. And then if you haven't all read Alan Gratz's Refugee, that's an extraordinary book as well. That's been a big inspiration as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm also a Jewish Latina, and I just wanted to say thank you for all of your writing. I think that creates a legacy for us as well. My question is, given that in America, most of the identities or the Jewish identity tends to be mostly European and mostly Ashkenazim, how do you manage to navigate and create a Jewish Latino identity when you're not the norm?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think I just continually sought to define myself along the lines of Jewish and Cuban and Jewish and Latina in various kinds of ways. I mean, in part through my anthropology, in part through poetry, in part through fiction. I was always finding a way to tell these stories. So I think basically what I did is just keep telling the stories, whether it was the two grandmothers or my own story, writing, just continually like representing that reality. And I think that's all we can really do. And then gradually finding an audience for these stories, because I think initially it wasn't that easy to find an audience for these stories because, like you said, Jewish Latina stories are not that commonplace in our literature. But more so today, I mean, now we're like so much more aware of Jewish diversity and of Latina, Latino, or Latinx diversity as well. We're much more aware that both of these communities have diversity, have religious, ethnic, various kinds of diversity to them, right? Gender diversity, et cetera. And so I think now we're kind of aware, and so I'm interested in sort of this double diversity, you know, on the one hand, Jewish diversity, where we have Ashkenazi and Sephardic, and having grown up with both traditions, you know, I was always like trying to understand this mix of identities and like what, you know, what constitutes Ashkenazi culture, what constitutes Sephardic culture. So I grew up trying to understand that, but I also grew up, you know, explaining to people that I was Cuban and Jewish, and people always going, well, how is that possible? How can you have these two identities? And, you know, and the typical question of, is one parent Cuban and is one parent Jewish? And I'd say, no, they're both Cuban and Jewish. They have this double identity, and then that always led to having to tell the story, well, how did Jews get to Cuba? So then I always had to tell like the history, and somehow I was always kind of explaining, and kind of the story I told you tonight is sort of the story I've been telling, you know, probably since I was, you know, 11 or 12 years old, and just kind of explaining to people how you can have this mix of identity. What helped a lot is that both in Miami and in New York, there are these communities of Jewish Latinos, and particularly I grew up in very much of a Cuban Jewish subculture in New York. My parents had a lot of friends from Cuba who were Jewish, and so I came to see that as, okay, well, I guess this exists, this is an identity. And the other interesting thing is we would often go to a Chinese-Cuban restaurant in New York, in Queens, and I kind of grew up going to this restaurant called Asia Continental, Asia Continental. From the time I was a kid, we would go to Jones Beach, and then like the 5 different parents with the kids and my parents, it was like, okay, we'd go to the beach and everybody would come home, take a shower, and we'd all meet at this Chinese-Cuban restaurant. And somehow seeing that there were Chinese Cubans, I thought, well, if Chinese Cubans exist, then I guess Jewish Cubans can exist too. And it was just, you know, seeing like their mix, you know, where you had sopachina and, you know, frijoles and plátanos. It was like, okay, they're mixing things just like we're mixing things. And it was like, that was like an early revelation for me, that if you could be Chinese Cuban, you could be Jewish Cuban. And just kind of like understanding that there was, you know, this diversity. So I think that's what's helped me. But really it's been a matter of just telling the stories and listening to the stories and passing them on, and just, you know, letting people know that this identity exists. Yeah.
Cool. One more? Okay, that's, sure. Yeah.
It finally came to me. I was like, I know I'm going to have a question. So I found your work when I was an undergraduate student. I studied a lot of your anthropological work in Jewish Cuba. And one thing that my research led me to was the Spanish language in like the younger generation, so like past your generation, where families have, you know, Jewish Cuban roots and so on. Because it's been a long time since I've been in school, has your research led you to any of those newer, younger generations, and are they maintaining the Spanish language in the same way that you have been able to? Well, it's a common problem in the US, usually by like 3rd generation. Yeah. We're losing the language, so just curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. There's definitely a need to do more research, and I, you know, definitely realize like the gaps in my knowledge. You know, I've also been researching the Cuban Jewish community in Miami, and I've been, you know, recognizing that I really know mostly the elders, and that I have to look at, you know, like the generation of like my younger cousins, you know, who are in their teens and 20s, you know, that's the generation that I really need to start interviewing and seeing, you know, how they connect. I'm really interested in that. And in the book, I kind of explore it, because my last protagonist, you know, Paloma, is 12, and she's trying to understand, you know, what have I inherited, you know, from all of these people who came before me. So definitely something I want to do, but there isn't a lot of literature about that. And when I think about even like Cubans who are migrating now to the US, we really don't have that many stories about them. Like now and then there'll be a newspaper article, but not like a full, you know, book or research study. So yeah, so that's something that needs to happen. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Round of applause, please. Yeah. Really, really incredible. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Touro Synagogue and to Rabbi Bowman for hosting us. It's wrapped, so you can open it later, but we just wanted to give you a little token of our appreciation. There's a lovely book in there. And I'd also, if we have a little bit of time, I'd like to invite everybody outside. We have some refreshments. We have 3 of Ruth's titles for sale. And hopefully you'll be able to stick around and maybe sign them and talk a little bit. So yeah, I invite you all out to the, right outside this door here, and you can hang a left, and we have 3 titles, including her latest book for purchase.
Thank you so much. Yep. Oh, yeah, let's take a picture.
pero soy venezolana.